Hey guys, Heidi Preeb here. Today I wanted to talk about something that I've been thinking a lot about over the past couple of weeks, and that is the fearful-avoidant attachment style and their relationship with anger. So for those of you who don't know, I like to think of myself as much more centered in secure attachment these days. I've been working extensively over the past couple of years on healing my own attachment style, but the attachment style that I started out with and lived most of my life with is the fearful-avoidant attachment style. And one of the things that I believed for most of my life very strongly, this was actually kind of the predominant narrative that I had about myself in my own head, is that I was a person who had extreme anger issues. So from the time I was very young, like I was diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder as a very young child, there was this thread that kind of followed me throughout my entire childhood, my teenagehood, my early adult life, that I was someone who didn't know how to control or deal with anger. And I always thought my entire life that the solution to the problem of me having anger issues was learning to be less angry and learning to express anger less. So I developed kind of myriad strategies to help me deal with these anger issues. I went to an anger management therapist who was actually the first person to teach me about attachment and how our relationship with anger, particularly with intimate partners, is very tied into attachment. I got really into like meditation and mindfulness and all of these techniques that I thought would help me feel less angry. And what I am only realizing at this point in my life, the problem for all of those years was never that I was expressing anger in situations where I shouldn't have been expressing anger. The problem is that because I had this narrative that anger was so bad and I should never feel it, I should never express anger. So anytime my anger felt like it was a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 out of 10, I would not express it. And then all of that stuff would build up. I would become so resentful, so angry, so intolerable of those feelings of resentment and anger inside my own body that I would explode. And by the time I exploded, it would always be a 9 or 10 out of 10 on the anger scale. And so I wasn't getting the results that I wanted out of the times that I was angry, because by the time you get to a 9 or a 10, it's pretty hard to self-regulate while you're angry. So what I would do is explode, usually at my partner's, and then I would need my partner's help self-regulating me back to a more calm and relaxed state. And often I would realize in those explosive episodes, oh shit, I really need my partner's help here. But my partner is the person I'm angry at. So now I'm kind of switching between a fight response and a fawn response, because I want to get my anger out, but I also know that I need to get my partner on my side, or whoever I'm angry at on my side, to help me calm back down, because I don't have good strategies for calming my anger down on my own. And I want to point out here that whether or not you do have good down regulation skills for when you get really angry will depend largely upon your upbringing. So when we are very young, our caregivers have to teach us how to calm down our nervous systems from anger and how to return to a baseline. And if we learn that skill, we grow up knowing how to do it for ourselves. But I think that many fearful avoidants, I would almost argue the majority, if not all of them, have not had healthy experiences from their caregivers learning to downregulate from anger. I think that very often those who develop a fearful avoidant attachment style grew up in the family scapegoat role, which I have a whole video on that I will link in the description of this video. But what happens when you're scapegoated in your family is that you are chronically told that your anger is invalid, that you are overreacting, that when you point out the family dysfunction and when you break that rule that is inherent to dysfunctional family systems, which is don't talk about it, you get called crazy or irrational or overly angry. And your normal, healthy, human anger response, which is absolutely the appropriate response to injustice, is pathologized in you. So you learn, anytime I feel angry, I must be behaving irrationally. And when you grow up with that belief, it becomes very easy to internalize it and to dismiss all of those things that you feel very slightly low-grade angry about until you absolutely can't take it anymore, and then you will have those explosions, right? So what is blowing my mind at this point in my life is realizing that all of those years when I felt so sure that I was struggling with anger issues, what was actually happening was that I was refusing to respond in all of the situations where it was actually extremely appropriate for me to feel low-level anger, where I truly was picking up on injustices, either in my relationships with people or in the world in general, that it made perfect sense for me to be angry about. But because I'd gotten in this habit of kind of gaslighting myself and telling myself any anger I feel is irrational and invalid, I never expressed any of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7s, or sometimes even 8s out of 10 on the anger scale. And so things that I could have resolved at the time, if I had expressed anger at the time, grew into much bigger problems. And I think that this is such a struggle for the fearful avoidant specifically, because we do have that avoidance mechanism as our baseline for our attachment system. So those on the avoidant side of the attachment spectrum tend to repress anger pretty much to the extent that they can get away with it. Now, this doesn't mean they don't feel anger. It does not mean that anger is not present in their bodies, but it means that for the most part, those on the avoidance spectrum do not experience a lot of conscious anger. Or if they do, they might kind of brush it off as, well, I'm just feeling annoyed, I'm just feeling frustrated, I'm just having a bad day, I just need to get a better sleep tonight, or whatever it is. Or they might feel annoyed or frustrated at other people refusing to take responsibility for what they believe it is their responsibility to take on. But even then, they tend to bring it back to, well, it's just my responsibility to not engage with things that make me angry. So there is this kind of disconnect between the feelings of anger that live in the body of anyone who has an avoidant attachment style and the conscious experience of anger, which is minimal. Now, here's where it gets tricky for the fearful avoidant. Because the anxious attachment spectrum experiences anger quite viscerally and quite consciously, the fearful avoidant will often go from living in avoidance mode, where a lot of the feelings that they have are not crossing the threshold into their conscious awareness, and then something will trigger them into an anxious attachment response, and suddenly it's like all of that anger that's been in their body that they've been feeling for a long time, that's been building up, is right in the forefront of their conscious awareness. And now, all of a sudden, over something that might be a 1 or 2 out of 10 for someone else, they are experiencing a level 9 or 10 anger response. So there is this giant blow up that happens, and then afterwards they feel intensely guilty and go right back into telling themselves, every time I feel anger, it's irrational. Now, the solution here is actually not to be less angry. The solution is to learn to be more angry on a lower scale at the appropriate times, okay? But I think like every fearful avoidant out there thinks that what they need to do is learn to get their anger under wraps. No, you actually need to sensitize yourself to your anger while it's happening. Don't listen to that voice in your head that tells you, I don't have a right to be angry about this. If you are feeling angry, you have a right to be angry. Now, that does not mean that you can express it in an abusive or deliberately harmful way, but it does mean that you have the right to feel that feeling in your body, okay? And in order to get that feeling out of your body, it can help to express it outwardly. And again, because you only have the skills for dealing with like explosive anger, you might think there is no healthy way to express anger, but there absolutely is. And I am going to make future videos on this because I think that it absolutely warrants a lot of its own explanation. But I think that you'll find that anger is a self-correcting force. So if you express a boundary to someone the first time something you're uncomfortable with happens, they're a lot less likely to do it the second time. And definitely, if you express that same boundary again the second time, and you express that you're angry about them crossing it, they're now a lot less likely to do it the third time. But if every single time your boundary gets crossed, you tell yourself, ooh, it doesn't make sense for me to be angry about that, so I'm just going to ignore it and hope it goes away. By the 10th time they cross your boundary, now you're very angry, and also they have a long list of times that you didn't speak up, so now you feel less justified in your anger because you are the one who didn't set the boundary. But if from the beginning you had recognized, I am like a 2 or 3 out of 10 on the anger scale, and it's going to be helpful in the long run for me to speak up about it, you could have stopped an entire sequence of events from happening that eventually led to that 10 out of 10 response, right? So this is exactly what I like to remind myself of when I still frequently have the thought to myself, this doesn't make sense to express. It's not a big enough problem for me to bring it up and talk to someone about it. I remind myself, the fact that it feels small is the reason why you should bring it up. The fact that it's currently a 2 out of 10 on the anger scale means it's actually in the optimal zone for resolving that problem before it gets bigger, right? Because by the time you're at even like a 5 or 6 out of 10, there can be a lot happening in your body, a lot of anger building up that can make it harder to speak calmly and clearly about the problem as it's happening. But When things are low level, it's easy for us to resolve them because they generally aren't impacting us that strongly yet. They're generally things we can go into conversations with people about and have a fairly calm, fairly easily inoffensive experience of expressing our anger and have things be resolved in a way that doesn't hurt too many feelings because it's just not that heated yet for either person. But in order to get in the practice of doing that, you have to learn to bypass the voice in your head that will perpetually pop up telling you, don't express this, it doesn't make any sense to do that. And that requires potentially unpacking a lot of your childhood history and the stories that you've internalized around anger. I think that a lot of fearful avoidants have been taught that anger is always bad, that if you want to have relationships with people, you have to have no boundaries. And so there can be all of this false thinking around, if I set a boundary, if I tell someone they did something that upsets me, I'm going to be throwing that entire relationship in the garbage. And the thought of throwing that relationship in the garbage is usually much scarier than the thought of just sucking it up and forgetting about whatever you were a 2 out of 10 on the anger scale about. So practicing this is about practicing secure relationships. It's a practice of overriding that voice in your head that tells you if I express any anger or discomfort or resentment in my relationships, I will be abandoned and left alone forever, right? And it also requires acknowledging that there might be some relationships you have in your life that do follow that rule because you have grown up and continued to engage with people who remind you of your early relationships. So you might truly be in situations where anger is not handled well. And that's why I also encourage you to practice this with people who you know are safe. Maybe even people who you go to and say, hey, I want to start practicing setting boundaries and talking more about what upsets me because I'm placing a lot of conscious focus on becoming aware of that at this point in my life. So if I come to you over the next couple weeks and I tell you something I'm annoyed about or something that upset me or something that I wish were different, I want you to know that usually I only express anger when it's really intense. So you might think that I'm feeling something really intense about this small thing, but actually it's probably that I'm trying to tell you about something before it gets really big. So I've been practicing this a little bit in my own life, and I even like to just tell people I'm at like a 2 out of 10 right now. Like, this actually isn't a big deal for me. I feel silly that I'm even bringing it up, but I made a promise to myself that I'm going to practice talking about it. So here's what I feel frustrated about or resentful towards you for in this specific situation. Anytime we're doing something new, I think that it helps to put a lot of safety cones around it. But the point I want to make for this video is that I think fearful avoidants need to stop gaslighting themselves and telling themselves that their anger is never valid. The only reason your anger seems invalid in retrospect is because you let it build up until it all explodes at one moment. But everything that was in there that built up over time was completely and totally valid at the time that you felt it. It's likely that it was a completely appropriate reaction to what happened at the time. But when you add up a 1 out of 10, a 1 out of 10, 2 out of 10, another 1 out of 10, time and time and time again, eventually becomes a 25 out of 10. And now you might be having a 25 out of 10 reaction to something that is only a 7 out of 10 reaction, and you look absolutely out of control of yourself because you are. But the only way to stop that is to deal with it when it's a 1, a 2, a 1, a 1, and it is going to feel mind-numbingly frustrating in the process, but that's how we work our way towards security, right? We sensitize ourselves to our emotions so that they come out in the situations that we're actually feeling them in, as opposed to all at once in a situation where it doesn't necessarily fit. So a practice that I've been using quite a bit in this area is radical honesty, which talks a lot about how to express anger clearly and cleanly and in the moments that you feel it so that you don't hold on to that resentment inside of your body. So I am going to make some videos in the future talking about my experience with that practice and how it's helped me quite a bit on the recovery track from fearful avoidance. But in the meantime, if you guys have any questions about this or any thoughts or aha moments that are popping up for you, I'm always curious about those. So please leave those thoughts in the comments and we can keep the conversation going. And until next time, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other. I hope you're validating your feelings for yourself and each other. And I will see you back here again really soon.